Here he comes, here he comes, here he comes.
Hey, Nameh.
Hey, how are ya?
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good. With you.
Yeah, good to be with you too. In this conversation, we're talking with James Alexander. Hi, James.
Hey, Nameh. Good to be here with you.
Good to be with you too. Yeah, James is, just full stop epic. The way I experience James presenting human design information is um, very digestible. We can look at your chart potentially and kind of see how that um, arrives or has the mechanics through his design, and to say, I'm really grateful that my energy has brought me to James. It was the conference 2022 that I legit bumped into you. Well, not legit. I mean, we bumped into each other, but it wasn't physical. Yeah, where I got, and I'll say, I don't know if you know this, James, but um, the experience of you on the panel in that room, and I felt how you were in a stillness in yourself that felt like it offered a holding for the people present, the people who were on the panel. Yeah, it was like grounded, it was rooted, it was kind, it was caring, or that's how I experienced it. And something in me was like, oh, who is this person? What do they have to share? Um, and potentially, do I want to learn from them? And then cut to, I think it was Teresa and Brandy's interview that you did on
Mhm.
their platform, where you talked about analyst training. And I was in the place of, do I want to do analyst training? And what I felt that was out there was IHDS. And it wasn't landing for me as a comfortable process of learning. It felt
Mhm.
too rigid. It felt too, yeah, my body wasn't a go. And so
Mhm.
when I saw and felt you speaking on that platform, I again was like, oh, what is this? And yeah, so I'm grateful for the containers that I've sat in and learned from through what you bring. So
Mhm.
that's my big, why is James here? Why did Name want to speak with you? So to help orient people who maybe aren't aware of who you are.
Mhm.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you.
You're
Appreciate that.
welcome. Yeah. So we're gathered here today to talk about, that sounded like we were at church. We gathered here today. Maybe we are at church. Maybe that's how people experience us. Yeah, so we're here to talk about the upcoming High Desert Human Design Conference that's happening in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the US this
Mhm.
month, September 2024. And you have a number of main stage offerings as well as this workshop, um, or it's put in the category of workshop. I'm not sure if that's how you're framing it.
Like a panel discussion. Yeah.
Great,
To centric communication. Yep.
great. So, where I'd love to start us before you kind of share your frequency and um, yeah, your rightness maybe,
Mhm.
is to talk about or ask you to help us know how you and human design found each other. Like, what was
Mm.
that about? How did that arrive?
I was on an awareness path for quite a while before I encountered human design. And I suppose I was, ever since I was a child and, investigating and exploring. And,
Mm,
I was a philosophy major, psychology major, and, kind of started there in the Western tradition and then started exploring in more Eastern traditions and got involved with a number of different spiritual circles, which if you're, fluent in the chart, you can see that my personality South Node is in gate 49, line 3, which
mhm.
also happens to be a gate and line that Name has. So,
Very primary. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Uh, and so part of what that means is there's going to be trial and error with spiritual communities because it's in the mystical circuit, right? And so I was searching and I found various pieces along the way. And shortly before my 34th birthday,
Mm.
I, I was attending a funeral for a young friend who committed suicide. And in the celebration of life, one of his friends, for whatever reason, was like, "Hey, have you heard about human design?"
Interesting.
And, it it was intriguing. It wasn't fireworks right off the bat. It was intriguing. A couple months later, I felt moved to look for a reading. And I ended up finding someone. I was traveling actually to the West Coast, and I found someone who was available to meet in person. And we had this kind of combination, like foundation reading meets sort of psychotherapeutic sort of session to deal with some of the things I was going through. And I felt incredibly seen. I had never felt so seen in my life. So it was either this person was the most powerful psychic I'd ever met, or this system was incredible and important and worth experimenting with.
Mm.
Having said that, my initial response was really just to explore strategy and authority and
Mm.
some basic things like, okay, I got this profile. Let me notice how that shows up. I'm this thing called a triple split. What's that about? So I took on these few really big essential concepts and strategy and authority. And I just played with that for a couple of years. And then I was in a work context in which there were people asking me for some coaching. Um, and so I started to offer sort of somatic awareness coaching with these coworkers, which is quite an unorthodox situation, but that's what life presented. And lo and behold, what came out of my mouth was strategy and authority.
Mm.
I had no intention of doing anything with human design. I was not an expert on the field at the time. I just had my own experience. So, what woke up for me in that moment in this very organic way was, wow, I'm ready to now go deeper with this information. And so then I was on a hunt for, well, who can I learn from? And I think like many people who are drawn to my analyst training, I wasn't really finding my person too easily. I was very frustrated with IHDS. Um, I found them to be very seven-centered. It just seemed like I was so in love with the knowledge. I was so compelled. I was so ready, but I didn't have anyone. And then eventually, everything kind of unfolds at the right time. I discovered a woman named Kamud Kabir, who was trained directly by Ra. She's a 6'3", single definition projector with just the channel of wavelength, about 10 6 lines in her chart as well. And just from looking at her website, reading her web copy, I was
Mm.
deeply moved. And we entered into she essentially became my mentor over about 5 years. We probably worked together about 100 hours. And, she trained me directly on rave cartography. And then it was very experiential. It was very much about what's arising, meeting it,
Mm.
um, fully in my experience with some reference to the chart. So that's when I was like, wow, the way this woman is holding the information, the way that we're working together, this is what I've been looking for. This is human design. And so my lineage is very much Ra to Kamud. I've ingested that, and now I'm offering
Mm.
an extension of that to my fractal. So that's kind of what brings me here
Mhm.
today.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was curious to ask a question about the somatic or the embodiment experience with your coworkers. Were you going the route of pulling their charts?
I did eventually. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
once I, suddenly was like, oh my God, what I really want to show them is strategy and authority. They all happened to be generators. So I was
Oh.
able to speak to them from my direct experience. And I realized I was out of my depths with pretty much anything other than, a generator. I was like, this is great, but clearly I can only work with a very small segment of the population right now. So, and what I love about that is that that's how I really encourage people to work with human design in the sense of, it's so fascinating. It's like this, candy store for the mind, right?
Mhm.
So many answers, but it's like, if you really just wait until it's authentically correct for you to go to the next layer of the information or the next dimension of the field. Then when you get to it, you really have the capacity to start to really explore it in your life and see how it shows up with your friends and your family and so on. And then it becomes rich. It's not just textbook.
Mhm.
Right? Because so often when people say to me, I'm like their second or third foundation they're reading, they're like, okay, I've heard people basically reading the definitive book to me. Like, tell me something I don't know.
Right.
And that thing that you don't know, it might be something you do know, but expressed in a different way,
Hmm.
that my own observation and the words that I would use, and my design is, I mean, I'm a 52 line 5 personality sun, which is called explanation. It's basically what I do for
Hmm.
all day long for a living. Logical explanation. I'm helping people understand the logical patterns of life,
Yeah.
right? And then in addition, I've got my personality Mercury, gate 62, the gate of languaging and the Maya, right? Coining new phrases and so on. That's my personality Mercury, and I'm very interested in how people express their mind clearly with those hanging gates from my ajna to my throat.
Hmm.
Right. So for so many reasons, communication is my game. It always has been, even before human design. I was
Right.
always a speaker, a writer, involved in the world of communication. So that's really what I'm bringing. I feel like I'm bringing um, depth to the system, but expressed in really clear, plain spoken, as you said, digestible language.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, I love how you unpacked that. I'm curious to, well, and also to name that resonance I've experienced in my process of diving further with human design is everybody at the desk job. I'm like, so I do this thing. So can I have your birth details? And I'll say I've needed to watch that process in myself because I'll have a tension with a boss or the hierarchy, and I'll be like, well, they don't have this, or well, and then it's almost like I'm putting that in the field,
Mm,
as opposed to like the biggest boss, the highest boss in the structure has the channel of timing
mm,
15/5, and
mm,
man, I didn't like that. My
mm,
5 is compromised that way. So
mm,
anyway, I'm naming that detail of like, yes, it's super cool to, I found it super cool to have people's charts. And I also have watched in myself to be careful how I'm not boxing them by their chart.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's also, I mean, you've now done a lot of training, Name, but I think it's tricky when you're well, when you're not that grounded in the information, because I think it's easy to draw very certain to draw big conclusions about people based on what you know. I
Yeah.
see this all the time. If people only know R type, they're like, oh, well, as a manifesting generator, you must be eating dinner around 6 to 8 o'clock at night. I'm like, where are you getting that from? It's like, and then they learn one new element. They're like, everything has to fit into that other layer. And then
Yep.
so it goes. And then you do deeper training, you're like, oh, wow, this is really rich and nuanced. We have to be careful about these
Yeah.
conclusions drawn, right?
Totally. Yeah, I found that for myself when I was in the foundational classes. I was like, okay, I'm not a projector. I've
Mhm.
got 3457. That makes me a generator. So I guess that means that I'm not okay to have clients or do readings because I
Uh,
feel projector-like, because
yeah.
all my other life force channels are projectors. And yet I've
Uh,
got this power. And I'm like, what
yeah.
the fuck do I do with this power?
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
anywho, to your point, there's so many layers, there's so many nuances that are creating the picture of who we are.
Right. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious, James, are you open to me asking how you experience various elements of your chart?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm curious what's first eyeballs were drawn to is your 26/5 in Neptune. What's your
Uh-huh.
experience of that?
Well, of course, it's veiled,
Hmm.
right?
That's
So
partly why I'm going there. Yeah. How does it unveil itself to you?
right. Yeah, so a couple things I would say. Number one, it's part of what's called the mundane diamond, which is the personality Venus, Mercury, Neptune, and Jupiter, right?
Mm,
So the theory goes, and I want to just emphasize theory because we don't have a lot of data here. The theory goes that um, you will rely on those gates more predominantly until you've really differentiated. And the crux of your differentiation is in personality Mars. And then it's the diagonals, the moon, the Pluto, Uranus, and Saturn that come to the fore. I say all that because the most obvious thing I can say to answer your question is I was in the field of marketing, sort of. Okay. I want to say sort of because I wasn't the marketeer. I wasn't the person setting the marketing strategy. I actually don't enjoy defining marketing strategies. So like the field of marketing is really broad, right? And so I was in the creative department or editorial. I was managing designers and copywriters, at times web developers, but I was bringing more of an aesthetic lens. And my strong suit was always, shocker, clear, plain spoken communication that gets across the
mm,
core benefits and the value proposition of whatever we're doing. Now, I'm old enough to have had expertise in the dying art of print advertisement.
hmm
And so I cherish the years I spent doing that because it's like the ultimate challenge. Can you tell a whole story in one picture?
mm.
You've got one headline, right? And then you've got an image. What can you do with that, right?
Yeah.
And so that skill set is still with me in what I really offer my students, in terms of the slides and the presentation of the material and so on. So was I the marketeer? Not really, but I was kind of in that world. That's the easiest thing to point at.
Hmm.
Now, the dark sides to that gate would be becoming a historical revisionist, right? In other words, in order to protect my ego, it would be,
Mm.
you know, telling a story to myself or other people that reinforces the reality that I want to create, right? So I don't really have to, my ego doesn't have to get bruised, right?
Right.
So that's one manifestation of that. I definitely can see that sometimes I get excitable and hyperbolic as much as I'm can be annoyed by Ra's always and never statements.
Hmm.
I don't think I'm such an always and never, but like I definitely can really be I don't know, just kind of intense or somewhat hyperbolic in some of what I say. So that's kind of what I glean, but it's, the rule with Neptune is take your hands off it. It's a fool's errand. You don't need to be chasing that thing. It's already there. Let it just show up in your life, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been on that trajectory with my gate 9 in Neptune. Um, and
Mm,
more recently, it's been really interesting because the desk job is basically me as a bookkeeper. I've always loved numbers. I mean, that's present in other parts of my chart. And I'm in an experience of this new learning, we'll say. And I like the details are my friends now, where in the
yeah.
past I'll just skip details and I'll be like, well, what are you talking about? No big deal.
Yeah.
Like I'm not seeing the damage of the skipping the details. And in this new learning, because it's aligned, it's feeling very juicy and yummy in my trajectory, it's like, bring on the details. It's like I'm seduced with my own details somehow.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting for me. Yeah, the other thing I'm always curious, this is maybe the one energy center that I'm what do I want to say? Hiccuped by or continuing to feel not as grounded as I want to be, and that's how you experience your undefined root.
Mm, uh-huh.
I mean, that's a big one because your personality sun is there.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So the way that I experience it specifically is through what we call the prime issue,
Hmm.
that you've learned about. So because my top open center is an awareness center, and for reasons I won't explain right now, the way that that root shows up as a problem in my psyche is not that I have a problem with keeping up. It's that society and other people are the problem.
Hmm.
Society is moving too fast. I mean, and it is, you know,
Hmm.
I mean, it is moving too fast. And, that's what I'm, focused on more so than having an internal inherent problem with that. So I often feel that I'm struggling to kind of keep up with the pace. And
Hmm.
that is exacerbated by the fact that I'm an emotional triple split.
Hmm.
So I'm in like the 99th percentile of slow decision makers,
Yeah.
and then I've got this pressure of like, hurry, hurry, hurry. Now, um, and I still struggle with this from time to time. And sometimes I do need kind of some external pressure or deadline to kind of get things going.
Hmm.
The wisdom is really around being, right? It's to understand that being is becoming, right? Um, my personality sun, those format gates there are
Hmm.
to do with the evolution of consciousness. So I have felt in my life this tremendous pressure to evolve consciousness, right? Which where it's just happening, right? I don't have to, buying into the pressure doesn't help anything, right?
Mm.
And the combination between the undefined spleen and root usually looks for people, anyone who's got those two, is I can't wait to be free of the pressures of survival,
Hmm.
right? So that can look like different things. It can be my mind conjuring up, not anymore, but I mean, there was a time where I was an entrepreneur, and the mind is kind of trying to look for this big payoff that frees you from the
Mm.
9 to 5, frees you from survival stuff. So there was those kind of illusions. And then in addition to that, it's also the pressures of day-to-day survival in terms of just the bodily maintenance type of stuff,
Hmm.
you know? Um, so it's all of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
there's something about what you're naming there in that last piece with your undefined root that has me pinging us maybe out of order to
Mm.
ask you to speak about the nine-centered discussion.
Ah,
So
yeah.
if you want to go there and kind of
Yeah.
create the container for people or give those broad strokes or wherever you want to take it.
Yeah, sure. So the nine-centered communication, interestingly enough, was actually my primary spiritual practice pre-human design. I was largely dedicated to that as a component of a larger practice, but as a central component for about 10 years.
Mm.
And there was a different framework around it in that context. There were some different principles and so on, but essentially it's the same thing. And I think a common reference point that can be helpful for people is if you've ever heard of, and I don't know what they're called, but it's kind of like when Quakers come together and they sit in
Mm.
silence and they wait for the spirit to move them. There's an essence of that here. So our charter in this other community was to really discriminate, where am I speaking from?
Mhm.
Okay. Am I speaking from, and let's forget human design terms for the moment. Am I speaking from the ego? Am I speaking from my authentic self? And what happens to the interpersonal field when you speak from the ego versus your authentic self, right? Very crude distinctions here
Mhm.
in that context, but still, we actually got quite a lot of mileage. Um, with the benefit of human design, you can imagine how rich that could really get. But so, as someone with a hanging 49, as someone with touch cognition, right? Which means I'm very
Mhm.
sensitive to the interpersonal field, and I'm always filtering for who am I in touch with? Are we connecting? Are we relating here? Are we unified in this? Are we being sensitive to each other? So it really was up my alley on top of being a 59-6, right?
Mhm.
And so it's like really craving that type of group unification and triple splits like the group dynamic. And I learned quite a lot about what happens based on where we're speaking from. And so what happens in this exercise is that you start to see that you don't actually need any gurus anymore,
Mm.
right? You've got your own internal compass, and you might say that the true guru is the space or is the room if you can tune in and see and feel what's happening, right?
Yep.
So if I show up, from the psychological territory of the ego, defended, there's a fracturing in the room. There's a
Mm.
dropping of the energy, right?
Mhm.
Whereas when I'm undefended, when I am, and not only undefended, but genuinely motivated to speak, not so that my ego can be heard, not so that I can prove something, right? But simply because something is really coming through.
Mhm.
Uh, it has a whole different effect on the group dynamic, and it was much more elevating, right? It's lifting. And if everyone can maintain that for long enough, there's this experience of a vortex that starts to happen, and this feeling of, wow, we're all really in something together, and we're very helpless in that, right? So that was the practice. I mean, also what's happening there is when you're kind of living on that edge, you're actually also giving voice to the unconscious,
Mm.
right? So you're discovering what comes through. And so what I love about all of this is that it's emergent rather than intentional,
Mm.
which is the crux of my distinction between seven-centered and nine-centered spirituality,
Mm.
right? It doesn't matter whether you're left variable, right variable, some combination. Life itself is emergent. Life itself is emergent. And so we're here to be conduits of that. So did that for 10 years, bringing that practice now to the human design field. And Teresa Brenneman
Mm.
and Mike Litvin and I are doing this talk, but we're also going to be doing some experiments with invite only groups, um, not just at the conference, but just ongoingly to sort of just pick up where I left off in that practice and add
Mhm.
what we've learned about human design.
Mhm.
I have a whole ebook I've written about this, because there's so many subtleties, there's so many things I've identified that take the group off track, that lower the energy,
Mhm.
that create discord between us, and so on. So I'm really excited to share that with the world, and you'll get a deeper dive of that at this talk at the conference.
And maybe this is my setting an expectation. I sensed in interpreting it as a workshop that we would be playing in these fields in practice. And maybe you don't know and that hasn't arrived yet. I'm curious if that's a component you sense now.
I originally wanted to do that, and part of it is that my eye hasn't really been on the ball of the conference too much because I've just been doing analyst training, doing other big courses, and my attention just spread thin. So somehow or another, it's kind of gotten to a point where I think too many people are in attendance, in a given space. If we had a big enough room, what we could do is break up into small
Ah.
groups and practice. And honestly, Name, maybe we could still pull that off,
Mhm.
and you person to talk to offline about that because you're also in Santa Fe and kind of well versed maybe on some spaces. I don't know. But I think that would be awesome.
Mhm.
I would love to actually give people some basic direction, get them in groups of, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, and just kind of pop in and observe and just see how that's going. As it stands right now, it's more of Mike, Teresa, and I, kind of doing this panel discussion thing and transmitting how we understand that. But let's see if it evolves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because there's a curiosity, as you were kind of framing out the potentials, my possibility view is always
Yeah.
engaged, can't turn it off. Um, is
Yeah.
you know, would you aim for penta or not? Or is that not part of the equation for you with
It,
this?
the thing is, it was never a factor in this prior community. We didn't have that awareness.
Hmm.
Uh, I don't know. I think it would be a big mistake to assume right off the bat that if you have more than a penta, it can't work.
Mm.
Uh, Having said that, I really think this is an experiment where we have to kind of see over time, what's it like when you have more than 6 people? What's it like when you don't even have a penta? That needs to be mapped out, I think. But
Yeah.
what I will tell you in full confidence is that I have had extraordinary experiences of being unified with a group of people and having things come through and us all kind of going somewhere together, because that was the premise of what we were trying to do, was evolve culture and consciousness in real time. Culture is, you get two people together, you've got culture, right?
Hmm.
So it's like, we were trying to evolve culture and consciousness in real time. Forget the intentions. It was a leaning in and seeing what would want to come through. I experienced that with even as many as probably 20 people in a room.
Hmm.
So there's something there,
Right.
differences probably, but
Yeah.
there's something there.
Yeah. And it's, having been with you in these educational spaces for the time that we've been together, I've heard you kind of, I don't know what adjective to put with it, but like, is this how it's going to be? Is this how it's going to be?
Mm.
And, I've been in spaces outside of human design where that's totally what we're aiming for is, can we do nonviolent communication? Can we cleanly speak about our experience, I statements, all those things?
Yeah.
And I've aimed to facilitate, or aimed, I don't, that word felt weird, but I've
Mm.
offered those spaces to people too. And I I experience some need of facilitation for people, even at the point that I feel like I'm at in this process. Like, I'll have people in my life say, "Are you going to teach communication?" I'm like, "Well, how the fuck do you do that? I don't know." Like, I love the question and I'm here
Yeah.
for it. And the how, I'm not there yet. And to say, like, yeah, it, it's it's an interesting space to facilitate. Not that it
Mm.
can't be done. It totally can done, and I have trust in you and Teresa and Mike.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it makes sense. You would have capacity there, Name, as a cross of explanation. That
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense. Personality sign in gate 49, right? Line
Yeah,
3, as a matter of fact.
yeah,
So are we being sensitive? Are we connecting? What are the
right.
principles to guide this? Totally makes sense. Yeah.
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 And I love also, I'm dipping maybe away from the conference themes, but it feels like there was an exploration or a trajectory of you with wanting to focus specifically on, emotionality, whether that's specifically the solar plexus, et cetera. And
Uh-huh.
I put these together, you know, to be able to speak about my experience,
Hmm.
I need to have, or not need, I've noticed it's more helpful when I've got a read on where my emotionality is at. And
Right.
so there's something where these are together. It could be like a
Yeah.
week long retreat if somebody wants to go that direction, because there's
I
so
love
much richness that takes us, whoever the us is in those spaces, takes us to map it in ourselves first and
it.
then
Hmm.
bridge it and bring it, because I think regardless of our circuitry, life force activation, we're being mutated, by those around us, whether we're the
Yeah.
catalyst or not, who knows? So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that's where, the very crude premise that this other community had of, okay, let's make an ego versus authentic self distinction. That's kind of like a forerunner of what we can do now with human design. And so I do think that if people were seriously engaged, as I hope I can find a group of people that want to take this on and commit to at least a 3 to 6 month run, because
Mm.
you need that much time to kind of get comfortable with each other, get acclimated, get into the groove of this. It's so contrary to the ways that we usually communicate, because it's not information sharing.
Right.
It's not an informational sharing thing. But I do think that the other part of the work outside of the group container is to get really somatically familiar with, how does my inner authority show up? Right. And
Hmm.
even beyond that, it's like, okay, I'm an emotional being, but I get intuitive hits. I've got a dormant 57. Okay, how does that speak to me? The more literate we get with that landscape, then we're coming into that conversation, I want to say safely, in the sense that, it's trust building,
Mm.
right? To really just speak from the right place, to own your stuff, right? To see what's mine, to see what's not.
Yep.
and so on. So I think the two go hand in hand, as you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love what you named earlier on about the being able to hear the unconscious speak. Because
Uh-huh.
what I've tracked for myself is when I'm resourcing and articulating and inventorying, well, what's here? What am I noticing? It brings a new awareness that maybe the stuffed down or the body sense, for whatever reasons in our, experiential lineage said it's not okay, or it needs to look this way, or it needs to look that way. So not only I experience it as impacting or supporting the container, it
Mm,
also brings juice to me.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
And I think it takes, or I've found it supportive if the people who are in the space with honor that this is about me. I may have bumped up against you. Thank
Yeah.
you. You gave me something to
Right.
bump up against to see, like, oh shit, I didn't
Right.
realize that was still alive. Oh, you know, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a way to handle that stuff. I mean, I'll never forget that in my work with Kamud Kabir early
Mm.
on, it was really triggered by one of our sessions. So when we like between sessions, so she came back and she was like, "Wow, I really had to go through a process around
Mm.
our last conversation, but it wasn't presented in a victimy way. It wasn't like you
Ah.
should have done something different. It was like, hey, I had this experience. It was really rich for me, and thank you. And actually, in hearing that, it actually really opened up another layer of pain for me to say, oh wow, I didn't. This is
Mm.
how some people experience me, and that's great to for me to really see in this safe container. So yeah, and the other thing that occurs, just in terms of you're talking about kind of like my individual experience, what occurs is gate 55 and
Mm.
what gate 55 is really seeking. Um, and it's a multidimensional answer to that question. I mean, what is the spirit gate 55 is seeking? The clue to that is the fact that the 59-6 and the 55-6, right? These are the polarity, right? In the wheel, they're looking at 40.1 and 37.1. So
Right.
where is the spirit? It's in community. And what are we dealing with there? Gate 40 is a love gate, right? 37, friends and family. So where do you find the spirit? You find it with the people you love. You find it with your friends and family. You find it with community, right? There is also a version of it, of course, 55 being so acoustic, being individual, that you feel it in a concert where everyone is synchronized. You're all moving to the same beat. You're all in the same experience, right? But the other dimension to this, which is really quite interesting, is that, you know, it's that 55-6. What is it mutating first? 37-1. It's changing the family. It's changing right at that core, and
Mm.
this is sort of like what people have been talking about for decades. Like the family is
Mm.
whatever,
Hmm.
under attack, the nuclear family, whatever. Well, the nuclear family is certainly changing. And I think community's changing. And I think the people, those of us who are sort of sensitive and attuned to this shift, that's why we've been gathering in sanghas to find that spirit together, because it's not necessarily a highfalutin metaphysical thing. It's the spirit that we're all in this together. I'm connected to you. But the really important distinction here is with 55, with this individual gate mutating the tribe, that's really what's happening. We're no longer a tribe of one identity, just this kind of mass, and we've all got to kind of fit our individuality into this larger agreement. No, no. Now it's how do we be a tribe or we preserve our autonomy and our individuality in this communal context? How do we come together and make agreements and have some sense of unity, right, without any compromise of our individual spirit?
Mm.
That's really what's happening, I think, and what has been happening in the spiritual domain for decades, right? And I'm so ready for it.
Exciting. Exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love
yeah.
feeling you articulate all those layers. Really powerful.
Mm.
Um, where I feel drawn, because in a sense I feel like you're doing it, and I'm curious, what do you have in store for us with this Heretic Sessions 1 through 3? Or because it's
Yeah.
hard, not hard, but and when I hear you speak, it the heretic is never gone.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. So the reality is that every year I do this practical heresy talk,
mm,
and I build on that. And, Jonah was super patient with me. He was like, James, I really got to figure here. What are you doing this year? I'm like, Jonah, I'm just too busy. I don't know. Just do a placeholder, heretic session. So no matter what. So the thing
mm,
is, you're right. No matter what I say, it's going to have a heretical bent to it, which, by the way, is just common sense you probably haven't considered before.
mm,
That's really what it is to be a heretic. It's like you might be like, and then you kind of give it some thought. You're like, oh yeah, of course.
yeah.
So it's not about being a genius. It's about kind of noticing the common sense things we all overlook. One thing that I'm really excited to do, the first main stage talk, picture kind of that Jeopardy board format, right? Where you've
Uh-huh.
got the topics. So it's not going to be a game, but I'm going to have things like um, gender mutation, the
Mm.
death of God, 7 verse 9 centeredness. I'll have all these topics that the crowd can choose from and kind of choose
Ah,
the adventure, you know, and I'm just
uh-huh.
gonna riff, I'm gonna put things up there that I have a lot to say about, and let's just see where it goes.
Wonderful. I feel myself like, can we have a voting booth? Well, and
Right.
also like the remote access folks, like,
Yeah.
anyway, not
Yeah.
to
We
challenge
have to
it.
account for that. You're right. We have to give them a fair shot. Yep.
Yeah, maybe they can vote for the future ones, etc. And I'm not meaning to change anything. There's just a all voices
No.
heard experience in myself. Yeah. And I love those three. Like, sure, let's do all three of those. Who knows
Yeah.
which one goes first? Yeah, and maybe
Yeah.
like a wild card. That could be
Yeah.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So I haven't even defined all the topics, but I
Mm,
want to take some of these things that are more culturally timely, the gender conversation, where are we at in regard to God and religion today? These sorts of
yeah.
things. Um, Organizations, what would it mean to be an organization that runs in a nine-centered way?
Mm,
What does that look like on the day to day? Because I'm living it. I now have a team around me, and it's like, okay, I've got a manifestor reporting to me,
mm,
work with this particular friend for 4 years. So we've got our groove, but what is it to honor her nature and
mm.
so on, these sorts of
Yep.
questions. So I want to bring it to like, what are we all, you know, tuning to in the kind of popular culture and in life and bring it back to human design insights.
Well, and I
So
love where you went. If I can take this thread of, having a team or, facilitating a team in a business, um, because I'm gonna say something maybe controversial. I don't know what the
yeah.
fuck BG5 is. I don't get it. Like, I don't mean that as shade towards BG5. It's
No,
just my body's been like, ah. And what you're
yeah,
saying about nine centered, I'm like, oh, because it's interesting at the desk job. I feel like that's kind of the
yeah,
foundational upheaval that's happening there. And it'd be interesting to run the organizational's chart.
right.
They started in 1997, so we could see some data. And
Yeah.
um, I guess what the question I'm aiming to land is, and I can cut this if this is not a landing plane, but how would you speak to nine-centered business functionality and BG5? Is there a crossover there? Are they separate?
Um, okay. So okay. BG5, which I've trained in BG5, and I do believe I trained with the person in the world,
Mm.
that is, yeah, the world's greatest expert in BG5 is Ilse Sendler.
Uh-huh.
Um, she actually took it into the world and did it, to some extent, right? Whereas many of the other people offering BG5, this goes years and years and years back. Okay. So we're out of date here. But at the time, 7, 8+ years ago, I said, hey, I'm curious about this. Do you have some case studies? No,
Uh-huh.
so, and when Ra tried to implement this with Richard Beaumont and his magazine, it was famously an absolute disaster, right?
Uh-huh.
Didn't work. So I can't speak to Ilsa's exact experience, but she has brought it into the world. She's passionate about it. She's got a very clear transmission of it. So I did all this training. Now, I don't work with it regularly. Here's what I
Mm.
do. I do readings for people that are professionally based, career based. Um, that's not technically BG5, although that's part of the training. That isn't BG5 per se. BG5 entails a process by which you're trying to have all of the penta gates, so you have this functional, healthy penta. Now, I
Mm,
find this highly problematic, right? So, I mean, first of all, you could easily be accused of being like, why do you need my birth information to hire me? Like, this is so
right.
slippery from a legal standpoint. You'd have to be working with the most spiritual, forward-thinking, unconventional companies, and they're out there, but that's not really what I'm interested in. I just find that whole thing to be problematic. But I can look at a chart and say, oh, well, as a fifth line personality, you're probably better off being a consultant. You're a stranger of consequence. Or let's look at the wisdom you're going to get from your openness. Or let's look at where your third lines are, because that's where you're going to make money. That's all great information. But I don't really work with BG5 in any other sense. Now, your next question. So I also think BG5 in trying to manufacture this
Mm,
perfect penta is perhaps a bit on the seven-centered side of things, it sounds to me. Um, the nine-centered way of doing business would be to trying to think if I can think of a specific example with my team. It's kind of like, you know, everything gets measured and there's all these goals, which are largely artificial, right? And the famous quote that I recall from corporate America is hurry up and wait. Everyone
mhm.
thinks I gotta need it now. We need it now. We need it now. Then you get it to them and they don't do anything with it for 3 months, right? So there's all these artificial things, too many goals, too many artificial standards of what's right and so on and so forth, where I've built a very successful business by relying on, I mean, instinct isn't the right word, but it's like my survival view, my common sense, my practicality. So I kind of had a come to Jesus moment with my team recently where we're like, forget all the things you think you need to be doing,
Mm,
because I'm not doing much marketing, as you probably know. I'm doing the most bare minimum marketing. And yet I have built a very successful human design business. And so I'm really trusting what
mm,
feels right. And it's like, we need to cancel the meeting. If we need to change this, we need to change that. It's fine.
mm.
We're in the magic slipstream,
Mhm.
we're in the magic slipstream. So I'm just examining all the little conditioned assumptions about how to run a business unit and all the different ways to assess whether it's working. And I'm really throwing that out the window and just tuning into my inner authority and having a lot of dialogue with my team about where they're at. And I think we're doing it, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
James, it's so lovely to experience you walk through information. It's
mm,
such a beautiful transmission. Thank you.
you're welcome. Yeah, my pleasure.
And there's something that I'm tracking in experiencing you, because usually when we're in a classroom, your your image is like a little tiny box, but I'm like getting more of the face
Yeah,
this time.
right.
And again, if this is uncomfortable, I can cut it. I notice you closing your eyes a lot.
Mm,
When you're
mm,
like, to me, how I'm perceiving it is when you're like tracking or catching or wanting to
yeah.
articulate something that you're sensing. And self-serving, how do you point that to your chart? Because I would
I,
put that to inner vision and you're not.
yeah. No, and I'm not. I would say that it's possibly a continuity with the right brain and all of
Hmm.
those. The other thing I would say is that I do have fifth color PHS. So the fifth color PHS, whether you're high sound or low sound, it taps into each of those cognitions more than any other color. This is where Ross says the root of the fifth line reaching strangers is. He says that the root of the fourth color, the root of the fourth line, networking, is the fourth color transferring to other colors. Like, you're my network. We're all in the color network.
Ah,
We're all bouncing around and I'm trying you out and trying this out. The fifth color isn't going between its network, the colors, it's going to the tones. So I do feel I have access to all of the tones in an extraordinary way.
Mhm.
Yeah. And you're right. For me to kind of, because I am going into my mind and I'm kind of, there's a visual that I need to get in touch with
Mhm.
in order to transmit that to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good observation. It's really cool that you noticed that. Yeah.
Well, and to ping back to an earlier part of our conversation, I'll say tonally or frequency wise, and I don't mean this as weird, I'm not trying to come on to you, but that's like where you're juiciest.
Yeah.
It's like um when you're talking about that vortex of the emergence, that
Mm.
tonally, those times, not to
Hmm.
put shade on the other times, but those times
Yeah.
it's like something's happening. You know, it's seductive, it's curious, it's
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, especially I think with those kinds of, with that example you gave, it's like I'm reaching for a subtle and abstract and somewhat elusive phenomena.
Mm.
And I've got to kind of get present with all of the ways that has imprinted in me, to find the right words. So
Well,
yeah.
and as you say that, now what I'm curious if I'm tracking is your triple splits, because I'm hearing as you're speaking about it, you're 63-4.
Uh-huh.
Maybe, maybe not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's visual. That's definitely a visual mind for sure, and tracking the patterns. Um, the triple split is really bringing in a multifaceted explanation for anything, right? So, I mean, if you ever have an email exchange with a triple split or even a
Mm.
text message exchange, whatever, text based in some way, and if they're really invested in that topic, man, you're going to see like, bah, 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 bah. It's almost like, wow, I just, I
Yeah.
got more than I bargained for there. Um, and, being the explainer that I am, it's just like, I always see, it's like, yes, and
Hmm.
there's that side. And so I think partly if I didn't see the red thread, I
Mm.
could be a confusing communicator because I see so many components of things, but I'm pretty good at pulling the red thread through
Yeah.
all of the different angles, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's cool. It's cool to experience. Yeah.
hmm.
So we're at the top of the hour. I could ask you more questions. Where's your energy at?
Yeah, I've got a few more minutes, sure.
Um, I'm curious. Oh, two questions are landing. Um, what would you love people who train with you, who learn from you, what would you love their experience to be?
Hmm. Safely challenged.
Ah, huh.
Safely challenged. And I could continue if you'd like.
Please.
So you were in the first cohort with the analyst training, and I'm doing the second cohort now. It's really quite interesting to just observe the differences in these cohorts. But the experience, and now I've got the benefit of I've got several assistants. I've got Teresa, who's really my
Mm.
closest collaborator at this point. Denise, who really helps put together presentations and all this kind of stuff. I've got Nangxi Chen and Mike Litvin, and getting feedback from people, and particularly Teresa's really, as a 59.6, astute observations about what's going on interpersonally. There's a lot of wounding showing up in regard to the masculine,
Mm.
right? And I we can bookmark, was that happening in the first cohort or not in your perception? But as of right now, and it seems like it's partly being facilitated by, so I consider myself equally, I mean, pronouns he, him, but I feel very androgynous. I
Mm.
feel fully masculine and I feel fully, fully feminine. When I'm doing the coaching work and I'm meeting you in your process, I really feel that that's um, where I'm extending myself in a very feminine way. the teaching container is structured and I'm taking you somewhere and there's boundaries and, and that's the masculine. But what I think that a lot of people in this community are yearning for, and most of them being women, as in all awareness paths that I'm aware of, unless they're explicitly advertised for men, are 95% women.
Mm.
I've never been part of any type of an awareness path community or whatnot that wasn't 90% women. That's actually an interesting topic unto itself because I have some understanding about that. And so most of my students and clients are women. And so here I am leading this teaching container, and it's like there's all this wounding showing up around the masculine. And there was a lot of individuals going through a process behind the scenes with
Right.
Teresa and with I regarding that. So the thing is that it's like, because I do have the awareness to see that I am an aggressive teacher
Mm.
at times, and that's not, but to kind of understand it's just an energy. It isn't directed at anyone.
Mm.
I think you know what I mean because you've been in the student context enough, but like, so there's.
Well, I was going to say in the first class or the first container with you, there's like this cadence at the end of a sentence where you're like, and I'm like, I don't fucking know. That's why I'm in this fucking container. So if you want an unedited version, that's
Right.
what was happening for me. And so my body was like, and I'm like, no. So am I fucked? Like, what's happening? No, I don't know. Well, you better know. We talked about this last week. I don't fucking know. I need to digest. I'm quad left. Anyway, so that's
Yeah.
one
Right.
way of speaking to it. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyhow, so I think it's yeah, it's safely challenged, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm starting to see that the 59.6, which I have, is a channel that surfaces trauma,
Mm.
given its nature, sexual trauma, as well as trauma to do with your sexual identity and gender role, because 59 is under the influence of the Godhead Thoth, and that's the trip. It's like, what's my role here?
Yeah.
Gender wise, sexuality wise. So there's a lot coming up at that level that we're now, with my team, is now able to name and say, okay, you weren't selling this, you weren't intending to do this, but this is what you catalyze, and you
Mm-hmm.
now need to factor that in and become aware of it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it pings to me also how you've spoken about your continual education around embodiment. And
Yes. Yeah.
you maybe used other words, but something kind of in that container. Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful. Beautiful.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because I mean, as you said, and even the frequency of how you spoke it,
Mm,
safely challenged, it held
hmm
that essence of safely challenged. And I'm
hmm
thinking back, one question that I remember bringing, I had a lot of questions in class, um, of intuition versus instinct. And
Yeah.
that was its whole, like, we had a ride for that one. And, in myself, I was like, I've got something. Here I come with my open ego. And James was like, well, so it's an interesting, I love that sense or that
Mm,
phrasing of it safely challenged. Yeah.
hmm Yeah. That was a great class. I really appreciate. You have great questions.
Mm,
And I
thanks.
remember we kind of went off in a whole class about distinguishing with those different awareness streams. What's a taste discernment versus an instinct versus an intuition
Yeah.
versus transpersonal awareness, at the cognition level
Yeah.
and all these things,
Yeah. Yeah.
that was really fruitful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, friend, thank you. I call you friend.
You're
I don't know if you consider me a friend. I consider you my teacher friend.
welcome.
Um, yeah, is there anything you want people to know as we're bringing this conversation to a close? Because this is going to have a wider reach
Yeah.
than the conference.
I would say that if you're just resonating with me, with
Mm.
my frequency, there's a couple ways we can work together. Primarily, my coaching books are pretty much going to be closed for the next several months. Um, increasingly life is calling me to teach,
Mm.
and so I'm in the midst of an analyst training. And unlike the first cohort that you were in, Nameh, the second semester starts in November. It's not too late if you want to kind of jump
Mm.
into that, watch recordings. A lot of people are saying, I'm better off watching recordings than being in the live.
Mm.
Um, and that can be for various reasons in the chart. So it's not too late to participate in that cohort. If you've really got the fundamentals down, we would do a one-on-one meeting to make sure you're the right fit for me and for you and for the class. And secondly, I'm doing a class called Rave Mandala 360.
Mhm.
Is also in, and we track the sun as it's moving through the wheel. And so we do about a class a week where we look at that gate in all of its context. What incarnation crosses is it a part of? What's the Godhead theme that it's under? What's its relationship to the other gates in that same Godhead quartet? What's the influence of the quarter that it's in? What's the true self-expression versus the not self? It's a super deep dive. So if you really
Mhm.
want to learn the gates, that's a great way to do it. Those are the two offerings that I have right now. And then coming down the pipeline in early 2025 is going to be a really deep dive course on tracking your emotional wave and process with Teresa Brenneman. She's going to be co-hosting it with me. In addition, we're welcoming non-emotionals to join, and we're going to really be exploring the relationship between defined solar plexus and undefined solar plexus,
Mhm.
and all the different context. So yeah, those are some things.
And what I want to encourage you to speak to, if you feel a resonance, is, when we were talking earlier on about how I didn't feel a resonance with IHDS, you didn't feel a resonance with IHDS. I think aside from just that depth of presence that originally drew me to want to learn with you, um, is the wanting to offer learning spaces that support the left variables and the right variables. Do you want to
Right.
speak to that? Because I think that's a really helpful distinction that sets you apart.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so my experience so by the way, I've done all the IHGS things. So I have that training.
Mm.
I mean, not all, there's a lot of things, but I've done PTL and some of the advanced courses and so on. And my experience was that there is a artificial notion about how to approach your reading. So it's very much a factory thing. And they have this idea that, okay, we're making a hamburger.
Mm.
Well, you put down the bun, you put down the patty, and then you got to do the mustard first. You can't do the ketchup first. You got to do the mustard. Then you do the relish, then you do the ketchup. Why?
Hmm.
Why exactly? And the most egregious example of that is run by a teacher that's a quad right. So that's really suspect unto itself. Here I am, three parts left, channel of logic, uh, three parts logical incarnation cross, and I can't even adhere to your strange formula that you've made up. And I know behind the scenes, they know that doesn't work anymore and it's breaking down. So that's a part of it, is that I'm really in my approach to analyst training. Most analyst trainings are, we're just going to teach you how to string
Mm.
together keynotes. This is no, I don't think anyone really understands a lot of these concepts well enough. We're going to go deep into
Yeah.
motivation, view, cognition, sense, all of the open themes, and fill your toolbox so that as a right-minded person, you can show up to that conversation. You've got your toolbox filled,
Hmm.
and then you let it get pulled out. It's a dialogue,
Yes.
because right-centric people, I mean, as long as you just even have a right mind, you're not here to deliver that classical, traditional monologue type of reading. And if you think you are, well, number one, you're going to stress yourself out. This isn't going to be very fun or very fulfilling. And you're not going to be able to do it long term because you're asking your brain and body to do things it can't do. So this is, let's really understand the human design chart intimately, right? And then trust, right? Build trust with a friend where there's no consequences if you need to. And you're like, oh my God, I really do have it in there, you know? And then just have a dialogue with your
Mm.
clients. And
Mm.
then your eyes going to know where to, oh, they're talking about
Right.
this wound relationship. I'm looking at personality Mars and how we show up defensively there. Oh, they're saying that. That's such a key differential.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very robust toolbox offerings in your
Hmm.
containers. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well,
Yeah.
friend, we'll be in person or um
Yep.
closer to in person super soon.
Hmm. That
Yeah.
sounds great. Look forward to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much
Um,
for this time, James.
yeah, it's my pleasure. Always great to be with you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.